Hey, how's it going? Nova here, and I've been making fan-made monsters for a long time now. I've spent years trying to analyse the many art styles of MSM, as well as trying to grow as an artist. And a lot of you guys turned to me for help and advice. So I've decided to take some time to react to your fan-made monsters. I asked you guys to reply to my post with some of your monsters for me to react to, and I'll do my best to give you guys some constructive criticism to help you get closer to where you want to be with your monster designs. Everything I say in this video comes from a place of heart, as I've seen a lot of the art that this community has created, and I really want to see you guys continue to improve. I'm far from one of the best at drawing in the MSM styles, but I can take what I've learned from my years of analysing and practicing, and try my best to apply this knowledge to your work. And don't worry, as everyone who has replied to this post has given me permission to critique their work. So let's get into this. Starting with this post from Casual MSM. Now I don't know if this account is Casual MSM or not, but I hope they don't mind me showcasing their art, as this is a great example. These designs are great and honestly really capture the Chris Elliott concept art style. A lot of this is really accurate to the earlier monsters that we see in the game. You can tell that Casual MSM has spent time analysing those styles and have tried applying what they learn into these designs, and it looks really good. Something that stands out to me is how dark these wings are. For this particular style, you don't want the wings to be this dark. Now I would say brighten these wings up a bit, but the rest of this monster is already super bright. So if white wings don't necessarily work, try other colours. Something that will stand out from the rest of this monster. But as for the rest of this monster, this looks really accurate to Chris's style, and I'm very impressed. We have this sort of guitar monster here. If this is a guitar, then these strings kind of blend in with the background here, and I think a simple solution to that would be making this background piece darker as well as brightening up the strings a bit. Because guitar strings are already quite bright. They're usually bright whites or creams, so having that be a bit clearer would make this a lot more understandable. As for some of the outlines on this monster in particular, they are a lot darker compared to the rest of the monster, especially when we look back at this one. The outlines are still darker than the monster itself, but they're still quite close in colour, whereas this is much darker and it becomes much more noticeable. So I'd also tone some of these outlines around the edges down. But again, I hope Casual MSM doesn't mind, because these are perfect examples. They highlight some of the things that will help you achieve that concept art style, but also show some things that should be a bit different in order to look more like MSM monsters. Next up are these pieces from Blueberry LMAO, and they are clearly not trying to go for the MSM art style, which is fine. You don't need to when designing monsters, but I'm going to give constructive criticism to getting closer to those styles. These designs look amazing, but something I want to point out about this particular design at the start is that there's a lot going on. Not only do you have these clumped up orbs, but you also have these parts of the body here, you have these spikes coming from underneath, and then you have spikes on top of the orbs as well. It looks amazing as art, but as a monster design, it starts to get a bit cluttered. So I think you could either tone down some of these body parts, or remove some of the spikes entirely and focus on the grouped up orbs. Another thing would be the end of this tail. It again has some of these orbs on, but it also has the same patterns as the spikes. So I personally would choose one or the other. Since we already have a lot of the orbs beneath, perhaps this could just have the patterns of the spikes. But again, this looks amazing. These next two seem to be major and minor forms of the same monster, and again they look beautiful as art pieces, but in order to get closer to that MSM style, there are definitely things to reference for a monster like this. You can take a look at Phosphor and Phlox, or even Light Island itself, as that will help you see which kind of colours and values to work with. The body and head in particular are very dark, and this kind of darkness is not something we see with MSM monsters much. It's a lot less darker on this version of the monster, and again it looks beautiful as artwork, but for MSM it seems too dark. But as we know, you're not necessarily trying to go for the MSM art style here, so that's fine. And also I like the little sigils here, they're very fun. Very cool art style. Next up are these monsters from Isaiah's Doodler. Again, these are more examples of someone who's clearly spent time analysing the MSM art styles and have tried applying what they've learned into their monster designs. And again, I have to say the rendering on this monster looks really good. But I think one thing that would get you closer to the MSM art style would be to not shade so warmly. You can see that on the pinkish reddish areas here, you are shading with a pure red, and same for down here. This cream body is shaded with much warmer oranges, and same with these candles, which also get much warmer the more you shade them. And it looks really good, but for MSM, it tends to avoid shading with super warm or super cold colours. There is a balance, and in order to get closer to that, try taking monsters which have similar features and colours to this monster here, and try to tone down some of the warm shading. But again, this is getting really close to that style, and the monster itself looks really good. It can be hard to tell what the concepts behind some of these monsters are, but that's my fault, as I didn't ask you guys to provide descriptions, so If we ever do this again, I will make sure to ask. This is a perfect example of what I was talking about with the warm shading on this monster. The shading here is a lot colder, but it's not necessarily bright greens or bright blues. There's much more of a balance on this monster. This is a really cool take on a bug-like monster, as many of the bugs that we see in MSM are either related or very similar in concept, like Bazinga and Humbug and Fungprey. Even Bobo and Zinf have similarities, and I don't know if this is meant to be a bug monster or not, but it definitely comes across that way, and that's very cool. I really like the colour scheme here. The greys and whites go really well with these green colours, but the light reflecting on some of these green areas is very bright. And I'm sure we've seen many monsters in MSM with bright lighting, but since you have so much white on this monster already, having the greens be more green would help that to stand out. Just like the antennas and arms, they don't have that intense white shading and therefore stand out more from the rest of the monster. Next up are these three from Gustapino, and these are some very colourful designs. And it seems that we have fan-made elements for this one. We have pottery, alien and fossil. And each of those aspects can be seen in this design. For the pottery we have these sections here, we have these planets for the alien element, and for fossil I'll imagine that's the actual monster itself. This is a fun design and it's an interesting way to mix these three elements. But in terms of MSM's monster designs, I feel like they would try to mix the elements together more rather than place each one on the monster. For example, we have these planets which clearly tie into the alien element, but from a design point don't necessarily do anything to enhance this monster design. I think fossils and pottery go very hand in hand, and you've already kind of put those two things together by having the monster sprout out from pottery. But then we also have this column here, and I'm wondering if you could tie the alien element more into mythology. Perhaps you could carve into the column, or even have scripts with prophecies on talking about the future and space and planets. There is already a level of mythology in this design, especially with some of the monsters' attire, so I understand why the planets are here. But I think there's a better way to tie them into this design without just having planets floating around. But other than that, this is a very fun design, tackling ideas and elements that MSM hasn't necessarily done before. This next monster is a fusion of Ruba and Wubbox, and I really like this. I love the colours that you've used here. The colours in these gradients are really pleasing to look at. But I think the main thing that could improve with this design is how you've approached the hair. I like what you've done with the hair, sticking it up kind of like how media portrays electrified hair. But when you look at this monster's silhouette, it stops you from seeing the arms. It's blocking out the shape of the arms and overlapping with it, and I think one way to address this would be to have strands of hair rather than these giant clumps. You could have hair zapping up this way and strands zapping this way and even down, and that would then give the arms some space to breathe. In terms of colour scheme, it looks amazing, but as for a Pomely monster, the limbs usually have their own colour scheme separate from the body, hands and feet. And changing the colour of the limbs would just help the arms stick out from the hair more, as currently they share very similar colours. The colour of the arms here almost perfectly match some of these hair strands. And as I said, this design looks amazing, but if you apply some of these things that I've pointed out, I think that would go a long way to make this design more readable. And this final monster is based on the nursery structure, which is a very fun idea. Having a caring monster which looks after the eggs until they hatch is a very interesting concept. The mushroom cap from the structure is almost now like hair to this monster, and helps to shade the eggs when hatching. Again, I love the concept behind these monsters. I think one of the only things I could point out about this design in particular is the perspective. MSM monsters shouldn't look like we're looking head on at them. Since it is a top-down game, there is a level of perspective that we need to account for. And so the way you've drawn the dirt here makes it look like we're actually walking up to the monster rather than looking from the in-game perspective. Which is fine if that's your intention, but for it to look more like it's a monster in-game, try using the in-game grid as reference for the perspective. But again, these designs in particular look really good. Next up is Bish Ver from Leon. Again, it's my fault I didn't ask you guys for descriptions, but with this one it's very clearly some sort of stitched together teddy bear playing the drums. This is another one where it's kind of on level with us, and it looks like we could just walk right up to it, rather than looking down. And again, for a doodle or for a render of this monster outside of the MSM style, that's perfectly fine, this looks great. But that is something to consider if you were to try attempting the MSM style with this design. I think this one's harder to critique because there is a lack of a colour palette, so a lot of these details which might seem like there's a lot going on could be easier to read with colour. But since there is no colour, I will point out some of these areas do look a bit cluttered. We have these spikes here which look fine on their own, but then we have something here which then goes into the arm. So I think either removing some of these details or spreading them further apart could make that easier to read. But again, outside of that, this is a really cool design and I imagine would look very spooky in game. Next up is this monster from Fire Santi. This monster's name is Butler, and they play the harpsichord by plucking the moustache. And that's very fun as a concept, it feels very posh. But I think one thing MSM designs tend to do is stay away from clothes as much as they can. There are definitely occasions where monsters have worn clothing, like Spirit's hat and Clavavera's variants. But I wonder if some of this could have been less clothing, and like here we see actual tufts of fur. Perhaps these parts of the suit or even the bow could have been some sort of feathers. But that could be something to mess around with. I think the more important thing here is the moustache. The moustache is the instrument of this monster and therefore should be very easy to see. It should be very visible to the player even on a small scale. Since MSM started as a mobile game, the monsters need to be very readable at a small size. And not only is the silhouette of this side of the moustache blocked by the head, but it also feels like it would be too thin to see from further away. So I think two things you could do with the moustache is thicken the hairs, so that they're easier to read from afar, and have them be longer and spring outwards more. Very fun concept, thank you Fire Santi. These next two designs are from Jabin, and these look very fun. This first one is their plasma primordial, and knowing that this plasma is rendered extremely well. I feel confident in saying that this is another person who has analysed a lot of the art in MSM in order to nail down the highlights and shading on this plasma specifically. I think some of the criticisms though come from the lower half of this monster. The first thing are these eyes. Despite being different colours, these eyes become harder to read against the body because of how dark they are. You can keep these cool pink colours but just brighten them up a bit. I think you can really start to see this when we point out the highlights on the tendrils and on the plasma monster and even on these red orbs here. These eyes have none of that highlighting and therefore don't stick out in the same way that other parts of this monster does. Since we're talking about lighting, we've already established where this lighting is coming from, but then this light isn't hitting any of these parts here. It hits the tops of these tentacles and the top of this part of the monster, it even hits here, but then it's not hitting any of these whiskery parts. So consider where your light's coming from, which would be above, and figure out where it would hit. It would hit the upper sides of these eyeballs, it would hit these little tentacle things, and it would also hit this tentacle here. Besides that, a lot of this is really well rendered and almost looks perfect to be in game. When we move over to their fan hole prediction, you can really see what I mean. These monsters share very similar colours, such as these teal greens and pinkish purple eyes, but this eye is a lot brighter, it has that highlighting to it and therefore sticks out from the body much more. If you apply some of that lighting to these eyeballs, they would look more spherical and, as we can see here, stand out more. Another thing you've done on this monster which you didn't do before is put lighting onto these parts here. Those are again very similar colours to these parts, but you can really start to see where the lighting is missing here when we go back to these. So a lot of what you've done to this monster just needs to be applied to this guy, and then this will look as good as this does. In terms of critiques, a lot of the line work is very inconsistent in thickness. The line art on the body looks really good thickness wise, but then the line art on these fish parts here are very thin. Same for the legs, it starts to become hard to even notice in certain parts of these limbs. But then for the claws, it goes back to being a nice thickness. So I think the two big takeaways from this is work on outline consistency, and then take what you've done for this monster and apply it to this one. Doing that would make both of these monsters look really accurate to the game. Up next are these monsters from Jammy, and all three of them are very tall and very unique looking. One thing that I do see across all three of these designs that I would like to point out is that it almost looks like you're shading with black. I mean, I used to do this all the time. I'll chuck up some examples on screen, but I used to shade with a black because I thought that that would make the edges of the monster look darker. But when you go and look at MSM monsters, you will not find a single example where black is used for shading. So instead of that, try taking the maroon of this robe and getting a slightly warmer and more darker maroon rather than black. Even these stars, they should be shaded with a much more warmer yellow, almost orange colour. Another thing to mention are all of these outlines being drawn with black too. Just like with the shading, MSM doesn't outline their monsters in black. So again, try taking colours of the monster and just mess with a darker version of that colour for outlines. This again carries over to this monster too, where the shading starts to become more black as well as the outlines. And again, even to here, where these backroom-like walls are a yellowish green colour, but then the edges are shaded with black. And I think that's just one thing that almost everyone has to go through in art, is transitioning from really dark black shading colours to figuring out which colours to actually shade with. I think the best thing to do would be take similar monsters to these. This monster is very similar to Blipsqueak in colours, from the metal to the pinks. So take a picture of Blipsqueak and try to analyse what MSM did to render Blipsqueak. But outside of critiques, these monsters are very interesting in concept. This monster is some sort of backroom entity on wheels and honestly looks like a very cool minor form of some sort of paranormal carnival monster. I love the 2000s stereo speaker radio look that this monster has. It's a very fun concept and visual style. Those types of items from that time period have a very unique aesthetic to them, and seeing that in a monster is very cool. So again, I think you've nailed the concepts behind these monsters. They're very fun and interesting. I think one more thing to point out are some of these details are really small. When you have a large monster like this, these smaller details, like I'm even seeing stickers here and here, they become really hard to see, especially if you have to shrink this monster down and put it in the game. And so I think to fix that, you could enlarge in areas like the head, shrink down these eyes so that there's more room for stickers, and then they become a lot more noticeable. But again, the concepts for each of these monsters are really cool and unique. So keep that up, and see if you can take on what I've mentioned and apply that to future monsters, as I'm sure they will look amazing. Next up is this monster from Riptide Riley. Their name is Mangle Tangle, and they are a nerve relative who plucks their insides. The concept itself seems gory, but thankfully you haven't made it visually gory. It's like how Nerve pulls their eyes out, but it's not super gory or fleshy. It's friendly enough to be in a game like MSM. And so I think the way you've stood these innards upwards like an instrument make them look less natural and more suitable for a game. And so for the concept, this is brilliant execution. It definitely looks much more like your own unique art style, but in case you are trying to make this look more like MSM, some things I do have to point out would be the outline colours. Again, if this is supposed to be your own style, this looks brilliant. The purple outlines really do complement the orange and greens, and that looks fine. But if this was to become an MSM monster, you obviously couldn't use the same colour for the outline of everything. These oranges would need a darker reddish orange for the outline. The horns would need their own kind of greenish colour. But again, it looks very cool in your own style, and that's not something you need to change for your style. That's just if you were to apply this to the MSM style. Another thing are the iris colours are very dark. I think the irises should be a lot brighter and more colourful than they currently are. But again, interesting concept and really well execution. Next up are these two monsters from Kit. This monster is Pheromin or Pheromin, and they are the Light Celestial. Since they are the Light Celestial, I like how you've gone about having these very bright yellows and blues on top of this dark grey. It helps the light areas to really stand out and almost look like they are being illuminated. One thing I do want to point out is this blue and yellow is famous for being used to represent electric, and that's already an element that we have in the game. So I think the two things you could do would be make a lot of this less sharp and jagged and maybe make it more fur-like. That way it would look less like shocking electricity and more like the mane of a monster that is very bright. The other thing I would do is maybe change the blue colour to something else. Maybe you could take inspiration from the Light Island sky painting skin, where there are so many pinks and purples covering the island. These aren't necessarily issues with your design, but the mixture of blue and yellow is famous for representing electric. And so I think anyone that would see these sharp jagged edges and this sort of colour scheme would assume that it's an electric monster. Something that is to do with your design, however, is it's very animalistic, which is fine as so many of the monsters in game are inspired by real life animals. But then if you look at Hehehe and Reedling, they're not just a hyena or a dog, rabbit thing. They have these kind of proportions and features which make them look less animalistic. Hehehe is tall and slender, standing on 2 feet with pointy joints, and just doesn't look like a hyena outside of their kind of facial features. And Reedling is almost famous for people not really knowing which animal it's based on, because it doesn't look like a dog on 4 legs. Ways you can address this are by messing around with the proportions of things. Currently the head is quite small and looks how an animal's head would, so you could mess with the shape of the head as well as the size. Perhaps the paws and claws could be bigger to make the legs look smaller in comparison. I'd say take a look at the many animal inspired MSM monsters and try and figure out why they don't necessarily look like the animal they're based on. And then we have Luma, the air, plant and fairy elemental Pomely member. This is a very cute design. The colour scheme fits in very well with the fairy element. As I mentioned in the previous monster, the limbs are usually a different colour from the fur of the monster. And so you can see how the greens of the limbs really help them to stand out more. I think one thing about this design is that the wings are very small. They're clearly trying to be the same type of wings as we see on the fairy element sigil, but I feel like if you were to turn this into a black or white silhouette, it would be much harder to tell that they're actually wings. And so I think you can exaggerate the shapes and proportions of these wings. Mess around with them and see what you can do to help the wings stand out more. Colour-wise they stand out perfectly fine, I just think it's the shape and size of them. And when it comes to magical celestials and Pomely monsters, it's really fun seeing how different everyone's ideas are for them. So keep making your own and doing that, because these are very fun. These next monsters are from Sampler. They've mentioned that these aren't their monsters, but are monsters that they have worked on. So we'll still cover them, and already these have such a cool style to them. They look very unique and very colourful, which I really like. They're very clearly not trying to go for the MSM art style, and that's perfectly fine. But I do want to point out some things that I think would benefit these designs. Starting off with this green monster. Just like with a previous monster, the kind of terrain around the bottom of this monster sticks out to me for the wrong reasons. It's not very tall or thick, and it's very jagged. If we take a look at Mulch, for example, you'll notice the terrain around the bottom of Mulch is very brick-like. The geometry of these dirt chunks is very simple. Sure, they have dents and cracks, but they are just bricks. But then we come back to this, and each rock has its own unique shape and is very sharp and jagged, and distracts us from the rest of the monster, which already has its own unique shaping. So I think simplifying the shapes of these rocks would help the unique shaping of this monster to just stand out more. This monster is very goopy and therefore has a lot of bumps to it, and we lose a lot of that bumpiness when our eyes are drawn to these sharp jagged rocks. So I think adjusting these rocks in the way I've mentioned would help the player or viewer focus more on the monster itself, as this again already has its own super cool shape into it. The rendering is really cool, the colours are very nice. So yeah, these rocks aren't necessarily an issue with your rendering, the rendering looks beautiful, but they're more of an issue with the design and stops us knowing where to look. This is another monster with really beautiful rendering in a unique art style, but I think my critiques with this monster again come down to the shaping of things. This tree is very rectangular and therefore looks very stiff. Of course, a monster in a tree would look very stiff, but MSM always styles their trees in a certain way. If you look at Bonkers, this tree has a really cool shape to it, and if you were to stick a monster into it, they would still look stiff without the tree itself looking stiff. The tree then makes up for it with such unique shaping. So I think rather than having all of these tiny jagged bumps, you can try and have the tree twist and warp. Make the person question how this monster even got stuck in here to begin with. But this rectangular tree build with these very evenly proportioned arms at the same kind of height make it look very humanoid, and monsters tend to not look very humanoid. Mammoth stands up on two legs, but proportionally is very far from a human. I think a workaround for this would be to have the arms be at different heights. You could keep this arm up here, but then have an arm down here. And just like the other two monsters, this one kind of has its own things to critique. I think one thing that's hard to distinguish when looking at the silhouette of this monster is this chunk of the monster. This tail is very large and therefore covers up a lot of the spacing of the legs. These two legs blend in a little too much with this very large tail. And so I think by having the tail come outwards and around rather than straight down would not only give the legs more space to breathe, but would also give this very vertical monster a more bubblier shape. A lot of this monster is bubbly already, like these antennae, these kind of petal leaves, and this tail. So explore that bubbliness by having this monster be more round and bubbly. By having this top chunk of the tail be more back here, most of this back leg and a lot of this front leg would now be much more visible, especially from a silhouette perspective. There's of course going to be situations where a lot of the limbs of monsters you'll find aren't necessarily visible in their silhouettes, but since you already have this large tail almost looking like it acts as the leg of this monster that it kind of sits on, does this monster even need the legs? And if it does need the legs to walk around on, this tail is kind of getting in the way of that. But yeah, these designs are very fun and colourful, and I love the rendering of them. It's a great job to whoever made these free with Sampler. Next up we have this Pheromin monster from Ghost Ghast. Again, I should have asked for some proper descriptions as I would then know more about this monster and their element, but it looks fun. When you have these colourful scales appearing all over the body, I think it's important to have them be consistent. These kind of scales that wrap around the body are much more pastel compared to these horns. So just by having these kind of colours reoccur here rather than these much more saturated reds and greens, would just look more pleasing. Another thing is, since we have all of these colours already, by adding so many blue and green spots all over this monster, it feels like a lot of unnecessary detail when there's already some important things to be looking at. By having these spots be as bright as they are, they not only distract us from the colourful rainbow scales, but as a result of being so colourful, they distract us from the head, and this is where all of the emotion will be. I don't know how they play the Pheromin, but if it is in relation to the head, there's a bit of a problem by having everything else be so colourful and stick out instead of it, because my eyes want to look here and here rather than up here. So I'd say tone down these spots as much as you can. They're not really adding anything to this design rather than visual clutter. They could actually be more like freckles covering the face. That way I now want to look up here rather than all the way down here. And those are just some things I wanted to point out. But yeah, the proportions and perspective on this monster are great. Next up is this monster from Cura. And I feel like this person is very good at picking out their colours. The colour scheme really reminds me of the Bone Island monsters, which I imagine they're a part of since they have bones. But they're also doing good with the shading. Thanks to the light on top of the head, body and even the bones, we can easily tell where the light is coming from. But something to work on is your outline consistency. Like one of the previous monsters, your outlines go from thick in areas to then very thin. And these are all like in the same areas too. For certain body parts, it can sometimes make sense to have thicker or thinner outlines, but all of this inconsistency is on the head alone. So I just try and work on that. As for the colours, you very appropriately have the outlines change colour with the colour of the monster, which is the right thing to do. But then when we're comparing the blue outlines compared to the orange outlines stick out a lot more, don't they? They look a lot more darker and colourful compared to the blue, and that can be distracting. So I'd mess around with the colours of the orange parts of these outlines. They're a bit too dark and colourful when compared to the blue outlines, which colour-wise look very nice. But as I said, it's very understandable what this monster is, even without a description, and I think you've done a really good job with that. Next up are these very funky designs from Ryrax de Komodo, and these are some of their monsters in young form. Since they are young monsters, there are different things to critique here. Compared to the young monsters in Dawn of Fire, I think there is way too much going on with this particular design. I really like the kind of clowny, jestery aesthetic, and the bright colours of this clothing really complements the purples. But if you were to put this next to, say, a baby noggin or a baby mammoth, they look more like a teenager. For such a small monster on a small device, the young monsters are even smaller than the original monsters, and on a small screen, they need to be very readable. And a lot of these smaller details, like these yellow parts here and the blue jingle bells and even these really thin legs, are going to be really hard to notice on that kind of scale. So I'd say simplify a lot of what you already have. Since you have these kind of yellow dots here, why not have 1 or 2 large yellow spots rather than 4 small ones? Maybe only have 1 button and make these circular parts even larger. Then we could have short stubby legs coming out and very large boots. These changes in proportions would make them look much more like a baby monster. Up next is this monster, and the one thing that really stands out to me is the improvement of scale and perspective. It looks like this monster is sitting down very similarly to how a lot of the baby monsters in Dawn of Fire do. And again, it doesn't have long thin limbs, it just has short stubby features which make them look cute. I'd say the smaller eyes make them look cute as well. But then my one critique with this design is this really large head is stopping us from seeing whoever this guy is underneath. I think either shrinking this head or moving it up so that this guy down here has more room to breathe would just help the whole design be a lot more readable. If this guy is important to the monster itself, you should try working on the proportions so that we can see them. Oh, and this final one's really cool. I really like the colours on this one. The luminous kind of greens against the blues and purples is really satisfying to look at. And I think this is an even better example of proportions. You do have limbs, you have legs and arms and a neck, but they're not super long and super thin. It's enough to make them not look like an adult. This is another example where smaller eyes often look cuter, and again the perspective of this monster, if you were to put a grid here, looks really good. I just think try to keep in mind what I've pointed out from these two monsters, and hopefully that will make your young form monsters look even cuter. I hope this helps you when designing young monsters in the future. These next 3 monsters are from Sebie, and these are more examples of almost perfect rendering for MSM. Each of these monsters have a fun idea behind them, but there are some things with the rendering that you can improve to make them look even closer. Such as the fur. I think you've got the right idea of how much detail there should be on the fur, but it's all kind of painted with an airbrush so it looks blurry and not defined. Which is funny because you have these tufts here which are very sharp and have outlines and are very clear what their shapes are. And these very defined shapes are very clear throughout the edges of this monster's fur. But then when we look at the inside, that definition is gone and it's now just kind of a blurry texture. If you take a look at monsters like Tuskegee, you'll see that their fur is almost always very defined. Even if they don't have outlines, you can still very clearly see the shape of the fur. And so to look even closer to the MSM style, I just think you need to define some of this fur more. I think another thing you could work on are the outlines of this monster in particular. These outlines are not only very thin, but they're also very dark. The darker outlines make sense for the fur, which is a dark grey already, and even for these darker ears, but for the hands, it's way too dark. But then again, for all of these critiques that I'm making, you are also doing so much right with this design. These ears seem to take very big inspiration from hair and look flawless. Same with the nose and the eyes and a lot of the rest of this monster. Like when we look at this monster, the outlines on this monster are nowhere near as dark as they are on these hands here, despite being almost a similar brightness. And thanks to these outlines being not as dark, it makes this look even more believable as an MSM monster. I also love what you've done by trying to take inspiration from the Wisp family of monsters with the same kind of hair and body texture, and I would recommend you guys at home to do this too. If you want to learn how to analyze monsters, take a monster that you like from the game and try giving them a family member. By trying to draw a Wisp-like monster, You can try and break down how Wisp was rendered and try and take that knowledge and apply it to this monster, which is what I believe Sebie has done. And again, this looks like almost flawless MSM rendering, but I think when it comes to the melting wax, you could do with more definition just like with the fur. This wick is very clearly buried into this part of the candle, but these clumps of wax should be more defined rather than this blurry kind of texture that they currently are. But again, for a lighter monster like this, you've very appropriately made the outlines not super dark, so that looks really good. But again, I think these look amazing and are almost perfect for the MSM style, so good job. Up next is this one from Nox, and they've actually gone ahead and asked me for more feedback. The first thing that I kind of notice about this monster is it's all really dark. Of course, there are a lot of dark monsters in MSM, but they're never too dark. And I think it's really noticeable with these kind of light horns. These feel like they're the right kind of brightness for what they are, but then immediately go into a super dark brown and a super dark green. I think you can mess with this a bit more. If our light is coming from above like an MSM, a lot of this area where the face is and the top would be a lot brighter than what we're seeing here. That way you can keep your dark outlines and have shading to make it seem dark, but this actual front section shouldn't be as dark as it is. So try applying some light there and brightening it up. I would actually look at it like that. I would look at this monster as if this is the base colouring, now you need to add some lighting to it. This kind of section here could do with some more lighting to make it look more round and 3D. And same with these arms, these could also do with some lighting on top, like one of the examples I gave earlier on. I think the design is very fun, it looks very bug-like and almost ugly in a good way. It's like a little cave creature. That's very fun. I just think now you've just got to chuck some lighting on there and brighten him up a bit. Since you have these kind of shoulder things here with this green, since that colour kind of looks out of place on its own, what if you tried applying this colour to similar areas like this, which has the similar kind of wrinkles and round shape, and even up here, having this colour appear more would help it look less like a random last minute choice. But yeah, I like this design, I think it's very fun and it looks kind of cute. Just chuck some lighting on there. And I think that's all that I can react to for this video. I hope that everyone understands that my critiques come from a place of heart. If you do take some of these critiques and apply them to your own monsters, send your monsters in my Discord server. If you want me to react to more monsters in the future, leave a like and let me know in the comments below. And thank you to everyone who sent me their monsters. Thanks for watching.